I might be late tonight, honey. The Morrison deal needs final revisions. Michael's voice carried that particular tone Sarah had come to recognize over their 15 years of marriage, slightly higher pitched, with a forced casualness that made her stomach tighten. Of course, she replied, adjusting her surgical cap in the hospital locker room mirror. The Morrison deal. Again, she kept her voice neutral, professional, the same tone she used when delivering difficult news to parents. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under her eyes, highlighting the fatigue of a 12-hour shift that wasn't nearly over. At 42, Sarah Chen Martinez had mastered the art of compartmentalization. Wife, surgeon, silent observer of her own unraveling marriage. You should get some rest when you get home, Michael added, the sound of downtown Boston traffic bleeding through his car's speakers. You've been working too hard. Sarah smiled faintly at her reflection. There's a complex neuroblastoma case. 6-year-old. I promised her parents I'd oversee the whole procedure. She paused, hearing the familiar rustle that meant Michael was checking his other phone. I'll probably be here late too. Just don't exhaust yourself. You've been looking tired lately. The concern in his voice seemed genuine, and that was perhaps the cruelest part. Even now, even with everything she suspected, knew about Rebecca Walsh, there were moments when Michael was still the man she'd fallen in love with during their residency rotations. I'll be fine, she said, touching the small bottle of antacids in her pocket. The chest pain had been getting worse lately, but she'd run her own ECG last week, probably just stress. You focus on the Morrison deal. After hanging up, Sarah stood for a moment in the quiet of the locker room. Her phone showed a text from Barbara Henderson. Documents ready when you are. Sure about this? Sarah typed back quickly. Yes, just get everything in order. The operating theater would be ready in 20 minutes. She had a life to save, a legacy to secure, and a lesson to teach. The chest pain flared again as she walked down the corridor, but she pushed it aside. She'd always been good at focusing on what needed to be done, at seeing the bigger picture. Across town, in a luxury apartment overlooking the Charles River, Michael Martinez loosened his tie and watched Rebecca Walsh pour 2 glasses of wine. The Morrison deal had been closed for weeks. Sarah's working late again? Rebecca asked, her red hair catching the late afternoon sun as she handed him his glass. How convenient. Michael took a long sip before answering. She's always working late. It's all she does anymore. He pulled Rebecca closer, pushing away the familiar mix of guilt and resentment. Let's not talk about Sarah. Back at Massachusetts General, Sarah scrubbed in for surgery, the harsh soap burning a small cut on her thumb. The pain in her chest had settled into a dull ache, but her hands were steady as she went through her pre-op routine. On the table, 6-year-old Emily waited, her small body dwarfed by the equipment surrounding her. Ready, Dr. Chen Martinez? Her senior resident asked. Sarah nodded, thinking of the documents waiting in Barbara's office, of Michael's carefully crafted lies, of the lessons people sometimes needed to learn the hard way. Always ready. Let's save a life. She didn't know it would be her last surgery, or that the pain in her chest was more than stress. She didn't know that in less than 6 hours, everything she'd planned would be set in motion. But she knew, with the certainty that had guided her through countless surgeries, that some things were worth dying for, and some lessons could only be taught from beyond the grave. The first thing Michael noticed was the silence. Their Beacon Hill townhouse usually hummed with the soft whir of Sarah's air purifier, a habit she'd picked up during her residency. But at 3:47 a.m., the house was still, the kind of quiet that made his footsteps echo against marble floors. Sarah? His voice sounded too loud, too intrusive. The guilt of coming home so late, of where he'd been, made him whisper her name a second time. Her car was in the driveway. She must have made it home from surgery. He loosened his tie, rehearsing the story about the Morrison deal's late complications. 15 years of marriage had taught him exactly how to smooth over these moments. A sheepish smile, a promise to do better, maybe plans for a weekend away they both knew would never happen. The light in her study was on, spilling a warm rectangle into the hallway. Hey, I know it's late, but... Michael stopped in the doorway, his practiced explanation dying in his throat. Sarah lay slumped over her desk, one hand still resting on her laptop keyboard. Her surgical cap sat neatly beside her, as if she'd carefully placed it there before... Sarah? This time her name came out as a croak. He reached for her shoulder, feeling the unnatural coolness of her skin through her scrubs. Baby, wake up. Sarah, please. Her skin had a bluish tinge, that part of his brain recognized from the medical textbooks she used to study. Cyanosis, she'd called it. A sign that the body wasn't getting enough oxygen. A sign that he was too late. His hands shook as he called 911, fumbling through the operator's questions. In the background, his phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Miss you already. Same time tomorrow?" The paramedics arrived in a blur of efficient movement and clipped questions. Michael answered mechanically. Yes, she was a surgeon. Yes, she'd been working long hours. No, she hadn't mentioned any health problems. He didn't mention the antacids he'd seen her taking more frequently, or how she'd seemed more tired lately, or how he'd been too preoccupied with Rebecca to really notice either of those things. One of the paramedics, a young woman with kind eyes, touched his arm. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Martinez. It appears she suffered a massive heart attack. There's nothing we could have done, even if—" She paused, diplomatically avoiding the obvious. "Even if you'd been home." The next hours passed in a surreal haze. Police asked routine questions. A medical examiner arrived. Someone draped a blanket over his shoulders that he didn't remember asking for. Dawn was breaking when he finally thought to call her parents in San Francisco. The conversation was brief, punctuated by her mother's muffled sobs and her father's heavy silence. They'd be on the next flight out. Alone again, Michael stood in Sarah's study, now empty except for the ghost of efficiency she left behind. Everything was organized, labeled, filed with surgical precision. Even in death, she maintained her perfect order. His phone buzzed again. Rebecca. He should tell her, cancel their plans, maintain appropriate appearances. But as he reached for his phone, something on Sarah's laptop caught his eye. An email draft unsent, addressed to Barbara Henderson, her attorney. The subject line made his blood run cold. Final version, last will and testament. The timestamp showed 11:42 p.m., less than an hour before she must have. Michael's hand hovered over the laptop, tempted to open the draft, but something stopped him. Maybe it was guilt or fear or the weight of too many lies finally catching up to him. In his pocket, his phone buzzed a third time. Outside, the first sounds of morning traffic began to fill the empty spaces where Sarah's silence now lived. He closed the laptop without reading the email. There would be time for that later. Time to deal with wills and assets and all the mechanical aftermath of death. But for now, in the growing light of morning, Michael Martinez sat in his dead wife's study and wondered when exactly he'd become the kind of man who needed to be taught a lesson. He hadn't realized it would be Sarah's final act of love or retribution to teach it to him. "She saved my daughter's life, you know, Doctor." Jenny Kim stood in Sarah's office at Mass General, running her fingers along the spines of medical journals. 3 years ago, most surgeons would have called it inoperable, but Sarah— She turned to Michael, tears gleaming behind her glasses. She saw possibilities where others saw endings. Michael nodded, his hand gripping a cardboard box meant for Sarah's personal effects. 2 days had passed since he'd found her, and the hospital staff had been sharing stories non-stop. Each one felt like a paper cut to his conscience. "Did she ever tell you about that case?" Jenny asked. She didn't bring work home much." The lie tasted bitter. The truth was, he'd stopped listening years ago, around the same time he'd started looking at Rebecca during office meetings. Jenny's expression shifted subtly. "Really? She talked about you all the time, every success story, every breakthrough. She'd say, 'Wait until I tell Michael.'" The box suddenly felt heavier. On Sarah's desk, a framed photo showed them on their honeymoon in Hawaii, both laughing as waves crashed behind them. He couldn't remember the last time they'd laughed like that. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sarah's parents stood in the doorway, looking smaller than he remembered from their last visit. David Chen's normally pristine suit was wrinkled from the red-eye flight, and May Chen clutched her daughter's old Yale Medical School sweatshirt like a lifeline. "Michael," May stepped forward, her accent thickening with emotion. "We went to the house first, the police tape. They've cleared everything," Michael said quickly. "It was just routine. Natural causes." David Chen's eyes narrowed slightly. "Natural? Our daughter was 42. Before Michael could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen." Barbara Henderson appeared in the doorway, her attorney's demeanor softened by genuine grief. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Sarah was—" She paused, glancing at Michael. "She was extraordinary." "Barbara," May brightened slightly. "Sarah mentioned you were handling her affairs." "Yes, we should discuss that soon. But first, I thought you might want to see something." Barbara produced a thick envelope. "Sarah kept a journal of every child she saved. She wanted you to have it." Michael watched his in-laws bend over the envelope, their heads close together as they had been at their daughter's wedding. He remembered Sarah looking just like her mother that day, full of hope and possibilities. She was writing something the night she died, he found himself saying. An email to you, Barbara. The attorney's face remained carefully neutral. Sarah and I had many ongoing discussions. More hospital staff filtered in throughout the afternoon. Nurses shared stories about Sarah's late-night rounds, how she knew every patient's favorite book or game. Residents spoke of her patience as a teacher. Even the janitor stopped by to describe how she always asked about his grandchildren. A portrait emerged that made Michael's chest tight. A woman who carried love like a lamp, illuminating everyone around her. Everyone except, it seemed, her own husband. She planned to restructure the pediatric oncology ward, Jenny mentioned as the day wound down. Said she had a vision for its future. Barbara nodded. She did. And she made arrangements to ensure that vision would be realized. Something in her tone made Michael look up sharply, but the attorney was already turning to comfort May, who had dissolved into fresh tears over a photo of Sarah's first surgery. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the office windows, Michael stood alone with the box of Sarah's effects. It was lighter than it should have been, 15 years of marriage reduced to a few books, photos and certificates. His phone vibrated. Rebecca, again. He'd been dodging her calls, using grief as an excuse. The truth was, he couldn't bear to hear her voice while standing in this office, surrounded by evidence of a life he'd never fully appreciated. Michael, David Chen stood in the doorway. There's something you should know about Sarah, about the last few months. But before he could continue, Barbara appeared, touching the older man's arm. That conversation should wait for the proper time, Mr. Chen. After the funeral. Michael looked between them, sensing currents of knowledge from which he was excluded. In his pocket, his phone buzzed again, insistent as guilt. The portrait of Sarah was still emerging, it seemed, and like all portraits painted after death, it held secrets that the living were only beginning to understand. The Trinity Church's Gothic spires pierced a slate-grey Boston sky as mourners filed in for Sarah Chen Martinez's funeral. Michael stood at the entrance, accepting condolences with practiced grief, his dark suit perfectly pressed. Every few minutes his eyes would drift to the third row, where Rebecca sat wearing a conservatively high-necked black dress and an expression of carefully manufactured sadness. She was too young, people kept saying, as if youth alone should have been enough to keep her alive. Jenny Kim paused longer than others while shaking his hand. Sarah would have appreciated the lilies, she said, then added in a lower voice, though she might have preferred the money went to the pediatric ward instead. Michael flinched. The flower arrangements had been Rebecca's suggestion, ordered through her preferred florist at what he now realized was an obscene expense. The Chens sat in the front row, their bodies curved toward each other like parentheses around an empty space. Mei Chen clutched a small photo album, Sarah's surgical journal, Michael realized, the one Barbara had given them. "We are gathered here today," the priest began, "to celebrate the life of Dr. Sarah Chen Martinez, whose dedication to healing touched countless lives." From his position in the front pew, Michael could see Barbara Henderson sitting near the back, her silver hair distinctive among the mourners. She appeared to be taking notes. The sight made him uneasy, remembering the email he'd never read on Sarah's laptop. The eulogies began. Colleagues spoke of her surgical brilliance. Nurses recalled her kindness. A former patient, now a teenager, described how Sarah had read Harry Potter to her through months of chemotherapy. "She knew all the voices," the girl said, smiling through tears. She said stories were as important as medicine for healing. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he gripped the podium, acutely aware of Rebecca's presence behind him. The words he'd prepared felt hollow, like reading from a stranger's script. "Sarah was," he began, then stopped. In that moment, he realized he didn't know how to finish that sentence. Not really, not anymore. "Sarah was light," he continued finally, the truth spilling out unplanned. "She carried it with her into every room, every surgery, every moment, and I didn't always appreciate how bright that light was." A soft murmur rippled through the church. In the third row, Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. Barbara's pen moved across her notepad. After the service, during the reception at his house, Michael noticed the subtle choreography of knowledge and secrets. Hospital staff clustered in corners, speaking in low voices. Sarah's parents accepted condolences while shooting pointed looks at Barbara. And Rebecca managed to stay exactly the right distance away, playing the role of grieving colleague with an actor's precision. "She was asking about the Morrison property last week," Michael overheard Rebecca telling another realtor from their firm. Such a shock losing her so suddenly. The Morrison property, the lie he'd used on Sarah's last night. Michael's stomach churned. "Mr. Martinez," Barbara's voice made him jump. "We should discuss the will reading. Tomorrow, if you're available." "Tomorrow? Isn't that rather soon?" Barbara's smile didn't reach her eyes. Sarah was very specific about the timing. She always did have perfect procedure, didn't she? Before Michael could respond, Mei Chen appeared at his elbow. "Michael, these photos—" She held out the surgical journal, open to a page where Sarah had documented a particularly difficult case. The notes were meticulous, the margins filled with personal observations about the patient's favorite colors, foods, dreams for the future. She noticed everything, May said softly. Everything and everyone. The weight of those words hung in the air. Across the room, Rebecca was making a subtle exit, her performance as the respectful colleague complete. Barbara watched her go, still taking notes. And Michael, standing in his own home surrounded by evidence of his wife's extraordinary life, began to feel the first real stirrings of fear. Not of death. He'd already faced that. No, this was the fear of what Sarah might have noticed, might have documented, might have planned. The funeral dance was ending, but something told him Sarah's final performance was just beginning. 2 weeks after the funeral, Michael's Beacon Hill study had become a war room. Papers covered his mahogany desk, property valuations, investment portfolios, preliminary inheritance estimates. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across documents that reduced Sarah's life to cold numbers. "The medical practice properties alone are worth 11 million, Rebecca said, highlighting another line on the spreadsheet. She'd shed her funeral demeanor like an old coat, her red hair loose around her shoulders as she perched on the edge of his desk. "And that's just the Boston locations." Michael swirled the scotch in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "Her parents might contest it. They can't. You were her husband. Their daughter died without children and without a will." "About that," Michael set down his glass. "There was an email draft the night she died, something about a will, addressed to Barbara Henderson." Rebecca's perfectly manicured nails drummed against the desk. "Did you read it?" "No." "Then it doesn't exist." She leaned closer, her perfume, the same one she'd worn at the funeral, filling the air between them. "Michael, think about it. If Sarah had made a will, Barbara would have produced it by now." As if summoned by her name, Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Barbara Henderson. "Will reading tomorrow, 2 p.m., attendance mandatory." Rebecca read the message over his shoulder, her body tensing. "Maybe I should come with you." "As what? My dead wife's husband's mistress?" "As your firm's legal consultant." Rebecca straightened, adjusting her silk blouse. "We need to protect our interests." "Our interests?" Michael's laugh held no humor. 2 weeks ago, you were playing the grieving colleague. And you were playing the devoted husband, quite convincingly, I might add. Rebecca's voice took on an edge. "Let's not pretend anymore, Michael. We've waited 3 years for this. 3 years of sneaking around, making excuses, living in the shadow of St. Sarah and her precious hospital." Michael stood abruptly, crossing to the window. Below, a young couple walked hand in hand through the autumn afternoon, their normalcy a mockery of his situation. "We should be more respectful," he said weakly. "Respectful?" Rebecca moved behind him, her reflection appearing beside his in the window glass. "Was it respectful when she worked 80-hour weeks? When she missed dinner parties, holidays, your own birthday? Face it, Michael. Sarah chose her patients over you long before you chose me." The rationalization was familiar, comfortable. He'd used versions of it himself over the years, justifying each step away from his marriage vows. "The estate's worth nearly 30 million, Rebecca continued, her voice softening. "We could finally stop hiding, start fresh somewhere. London, maybe. Or Singapore." Michael's phone buzzed again. Another text from Barbara. "Bring all relevant parties," Sarah insisted. Rebecca smiled, a predatory flash of white teeth. "See? She knew." "Knew what?" "About us. She must have. And she didn't care enough to change her will or confront you." Rebecca wrapped her arms around him from behind. "She chose her work, right until the end. Now it's our turn to choose." Michael stared at their reflection in the darkening window. In the glass, they looked like success personified, the powerful real estate developer and his elegant partner. The future gleamed before them, bright with possibilities and unmarked by guilt. His phone buzzed one final time. Barbara again. Sarah left specific instructions. Don't make me send a formal summons. Tell your secretary to clear my afternoon schedule tomorrow, Rebecca said, already reaching for her phone. Barbara Henderson is about to learn that not everything goes according to plan. As evening settled over Boston, Michael remained at the window long after Rebecca left. In the gathering darkness, he could almost imagine Sarah sitting in her study down the hall, making notes about her patients' favorite stories, planning surgeries, writing email drafts that might or might not have been wills. Tomorrow would reveal what his wife had known, what she had planned. But tonight, in the room that smelled of scotch and Rebecca's perfume, Michael Martinez let himself become what he'd been moving toward for 3 years, a vulture, waiting to feast on the life his wife left behind. Barbara Henderson's office occupied the top floor of a Beacon Street brownstone, its windows overlooking the same cemetery where they'd buried Sarah 3 weeks ago. Michael noticed the view immediately upon entering, wondering if the irony was intentional. Mr. Martinez. Barbara didn't rise from behind her massive oak desk. And Miss Walsh, how appropriate. Rebecca smoothed her skirt as she sat, every inch the polished legal consultant. I'm here to represent the firm's interests in any properties involved in the estate. Of course you are. Barbara's tone could have frozen the Charles River. She opened a thick leather portfolio, removing several documents with deliberate precision. Before we begin, I should mention that this meeting is being recorded. Michael shifted in his leather chair. Is that necessary? Sarah insisted. Barbara pressed a small button on her desk phone. Now then. 2 months ago, Sarah Chen Martinez came to my office with very specific instructions regarding her estate, valued at approximately $32 million. Rebecca's sharp intake of breath was audible, $2 million more than their estimates. She expressed concerns, Barbara continued, about the future of her medical practice properties, her investments, and most importantly, her legacy at Massachusetts General. We intend to honor that legacy, Michael began, but Barbara held up one manicured hand. Sarah also expressed concerns about her marriage. Her eyes flicked to Rebecca, and certain complications that had arisen. The room suddenly felt airless. Michael loosened his tie. If you're implying something inappropriate, Rebecca started. Oh, I'm not implying anything, Ms. Walsh. Sarah had quite comprehensive documentation, including, Barbara removed another paper, receipts from the Four Seasons, dating back 3 years, always room 842. Always booked under the Morrison Development corporate account. Michael's stomach dropped. The Morrison deal, Sarah's last night. It hadn't been just another lie. She'd known exactly where he was. None of this is relevant. Rebecca's legal training kicked in. As Sarah's husband, Michael, is entitled to nothing, Barbara finished. At least, not automatically. She lifted a final document from her portfolio. Sarah's will is very specific. The entire estate, the properties, the investments, everything, will be placed in a trust. Access to this trust comes with a single condition. Michael gripped his armrests. What condition? Both you and Ms. Walsh must complete 1 year of volunteer service in the pediatric ward at Massachusetts General. Minimum 40 hours per week. No exceptions, no substitutions. The silence that followed was absolute. This is ridiculous, Rebecca finally sputtered. You can't possibly... Sarah could and did. Barbara's smile was razor-sharp. Everything is perfectly legal. The trust's terms are binding. You can, of course, choose not to comply, in which case the entire estate goes to pediatric cancer research. She can't do this to us. Rebecca stood, her composure cracking. Michael, tell her. She already did it, Michael whispered, understanding flooding through him. Every missed dinner, every late surgery, every moment he dismissed as Sarah choosing work over him. She'd been watching, planning, teaching him one final lesson about the value of what she did. Your shifts begin Monday, Barbara said, pressing a button to stop the recording. Sarah left specific instructions about your assignments. Mr. Martinez, you'll be in the cancer ward. Ms. Walsh, emergency intake. And if we refuse? Rebecca's voice shook. Then you get nothing except the knowledge that your affair funded a new wing of the hospital. Barbara closed her portfolio. Sarah thought that seemed fair. Michael stared out the window at the cemetery, imagining Sarah planning all this while he'd been in room 842 with Rebecca. The complexity of her revenge, or perhaps her final act of love, left him breathless. 1 year, he heard himself say. Michael, you can't be serious. 1 year, he repeated, turning from the window to face Barbara. Where do we sign? In her grave across the street, Sarah Chen Martinez might have smiled. Or perhaps like the view from Barbara's office, that too was intentionally ironic. The lesson was only beginning. Michael stood in the hospital locker room, staring at his reflection in the same mirror where Sarah had adjusted her surgical cap that last night. The volunteer scrubs felt cheap against his skin, the blue fabric a far cry from his usual tailored suits. Name tags must be visible at all times, the volunteer coordinator, Ms. Patterson, had insisted during orientation. His read simply, Michael, volunteer. Not Michael Martinez, real estate developer, not Sarah's widower, just Michael, volunteer. Down the hall, he could hear the sounds of the pediatric cancer ward awakening, the squeak of nurses' shoes, the beeping of machines, the muffled conversations that would become the soundtrack to his next year. Mr. Martinez, a nurse, stood in the doorway, her grey hair pulled back severely. I'm Grace. Dr. Kim asked me to show you around. Jenny Kim. Of course, Sarah's best friend would oversee his humiliation. The children usually wake up around 7, Grace explained as they walked. We do vital checks, medication rounds, then breakfast. Your job is to help wherever needed. Empty bedpans, change linens, sit with patients. I have an MBA from Wharton, Michael interrupted. Surely there's something more important than caring for dying children? Grace's voice could have cut diamond. That's exactly what Sarah said you'd say. Before Michael could respond, a child's scream pierced the air, not of pain but of pure joy. That's Tommy, Grace smiled. He just finished his last round of chemo. Sarah was his primary surgeon. Michael followed Grace into a room where a bald 12-year-old boy was literally bouncing on his bed, surrounded by beaming nurses. Hey, new guy, Tommy called out. Want to see my cool surgery scar, doctor? Sarah said it makes me look like a superhero. Across the hospital in emergency intake, Rebecca Walsh was having an entirely different first morning. When they vomit, her supervisor warned, handing her a mop. Aim the bucket better. Rebecca stood in the cramped hospital bathroom, designer shoes splattered with the contents of a 5-year-old's stomach. The child's mother was still apologizing profusely while trying to clean her daughter's face. It's fine, Rebecca managed, fighting her own gag reflex. Really, you get used to it, the mother said kindly. Sarah, Dr. Chen Martinez, she used to say that every mess was just proof that we were still fighting. Rebecca gripped the mop handle tighter, wondering if Sarah had orchestrated this specific humiliation from beyond the grave. By noon, Michael had changed 3 beds, helped feed a trembling 6-year-old, and learned more about Pokemon than he'd ever wanted to know. His back ached from bending over beds, and his eyes burned from holding back tears when Tommy showed him photos of Sarah at his halfway-through chemo party. She made me promise to keep fighting, Tommy said, pointing to a picture of Sarah wearing a party hat. Said she'd dance at my wedding someday. During his lunch break, Michael found himself in the hospital chapel, staring at the stained glass without seeing it. His phone showed 3 missed calls from Rebecca, and a text. This is inhumane, call our lawyers. But before he could respond, Tommy's laughter echoed down the hallway outside. The same laugh he'd heard in Sarah's video messages while he'd been working late with Rebecca. Down in emergency intake, Rebecca sat alone in the break room, her perfect manicure ruined by disinfectant and her hair falling from its careful styling. A young resident had just called her the new volunteer, without a trace of recognition, despite having attended Sarah's funeral. Her phone showed Michael's message. We stick to the plan. 1 year. Outside her window, a family was helping their child take his first steps after surgery, their joy palpable even through the glass. Rebecca watched them, remembering Sarah's words in Barbara's office via the recording. They need to understand what really matters. The lesson was beginning to sink in, 1 bedpan, 1 mop bucket, 1 moment of grace at a time, and somewhere, Sarah Chen Martinez's legacy continued to work its magic, 1 heartbeat at a time. She kept a secret stash of Sour Patch Kids in her desk, Tommy said, carefully arranging his Pokemon cards on the hospital bed tray. Said they were technically contraband, but every warrior needs emergency supplies. Michael sat in the too small visitor's chair, watching the boy sort his cards with the same precision Sarah had used in surgery. 2 weeks into his sentence, volunteering, he corrected himself, and Tommy had become an unexpected anchor in the chaos of the pediatric ward. Did she play Pokemon with you too? Michael asked, thinking of the unopened packs he'd found in Sarah's study drawer. Tommy grinned, revealing the gap where chemotherapy had damaged his adult teeth. Nah, she was terrible at it, but she listened to me explain every single card, even during the really bad days. The really bad days. Michael had learned what those meant now, had held basins while children vomited, watched parents crumple under the weight of test results, seen the way hope could vanish between one heartbeat and the next. "Tell me about her," Tommy said suddenly, laying down his cards. "The real her, not Dr. Sarah, but your Sarah." Michael's throat tightened. I'm not sure I knew her as well as I thought." "That's dumb," Tommy declared with the brutal honesty of children. "You were married to her. You had to know the important stuff." "Like what? Like how she hummed Taylor Swift songs during checkups, or how she knew everyone's favorite color but always said hers was tomorrow, because she believed in second chances." Tommy's face grew serious. "Or how she cried in the supply closet after Marco died, but came to my room 10 minutes later with a new Pokemon pack and a smile." Michael leaned back, memories hitting him like physical blows. Sarah humming in the kitchen, Sarah painting their guest room tomorrow blue, Sarah wiping her eyes in their bathroom after late-night phone calls he'd never asked about. "Did she—" Michael hesitated. "Did she talk about me?" Tommy shuffled his cards. "Sometimes. She had this picture of you guys on her phone from some beach, said it was from when you both remembered what mattered." Their honeymoon photo, the one he'd walked past every day on his way to meet Rebecca. "She believed in second chances," Tommy continued, dealing cards with practiced efficiency. "Said everybody deserves one, even when they mess up. Even Marco's cancer got a second chance, though that wasn't really the kind she meant." A nurse appeared with Tommy's afternoon medications, and Michael watched the boy transform from philosopher to typical 12-year-old, arguing about the taste of pills and negotiating for extra pudding. "You're good with him," the nurse, Grace, commented as they left Tommy's room. "Sarah said you would be if you ever got the chance." Michael stopped in the hallway. "She talked about me here." Grace's expression softened slightly. "She talked about the man she married, the one who used to read medical journals just to understand her day, who brought coffee to her overnight shifts, who promised to help her change the world." The words landed like accusations. Michael looked through Tommy's window, where the boy was back to organizing his cards, small face set in concentration. "I lost him somewhere," Michael admitted quietly. "People get lost," Grace replied. "Doesn't mean they can't find their way back." His phone buzzed. Rebecca complaining about another shift in the ER. He silenced it without reading the full message. "Hey, Mr. M," Tommy called out. "Want to learn how to play? Dr. Sarah said everyone should know at least one thing that doesn't matter, so all the stuff that does matter doesn't get too heavy." Michael found himself walking back into the room, sitting down as Tommy began explaining the complicated mythology of Pokemon, with the same patience Sarah had once used to explain surgical procedures to him. In his pocket, his phone buzzed again, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. Here, in this room with its medical equipment and Pokemon cards, with a boy who had known his wife's heart better than he had, Michael Martinez began to understand what Sarah had tried to tell him. All along, some lessons can only be learned when you stop long enough to really listen. Christmas Eve brought snow to Boston, transforming Massachusetts General into a white, frosted fortress. Michael stood at the pediatric ward's window, watching empty ambulance bays fill with drifts while speakers quietly played Silent Night. "Holiday shifts are voluntary," Grace had told him, "but we're short-staffed." He'd signed up without hesitation. The thought of rattling around his empty house, surrounded by decorations Sarah had chosen, held less appeal than the sterile warmth of the hospital. The elevator dinged, revealing Rebecca in wrinkled scrubs. 3 months of emergency room work had worn away her polished edges. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her red hair was twisted into a practical bun. "They pulled me up from the ER," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Some sort of staff shortage." They hadn't spoken properly in weeks. Quick texts, past glances in hallways. Their passion had cooled in proportion to their growing understanding of what Sarah's world had really been. "Tommy's room is first on rounds," Michael said professionally. "He's having a rough night." Rebecca nodded, following him down the hallway. Their footsteps fell into sync automatically, muscle memory from years of walking into hotel rooms together. Tommy lay curled in his bed, smaller than ever against white sheets. The Christmas lights his mother had strung around his room cast multicolored shadows on his pale face. "Hey, buddy." Michael touched his forehead. "Still feeling sick?" Tommy managed a weak smile. "The Pokeballs aren't spinning right." Code for the room spinning, a side effect of his new treatment protocol. Michael adjusted the boy's pillows with practiced ease, while Rebecca checked his vitals, their movements choreographed by months of similar tasks with different patients. "Tell me about the Pokemon championships," Michael prompted, using their usual distraction technique. But before Tommy could answer, the monitors erupted in sharp beeps. Rebecca moved first, professional instincts overriding everything else. "His pressure's dropping," she snapped. "Get Dr. Kim." Michael ran for help, returning with Jenny and a crash team. The next minutes blurred into controlled chaos, medical terminology he'd learned from Sarah flying across the room, Tommy's small body jerking as fever spiked, Rebecca's steady hands helping to pack him in ice. "Come on, warrior," Rebecca whispered, using Sarah's old nickname for him. "Keep fighting." Somewhere between midnight and dawn, Tommy stabilized. Jenny emerged from his room looking exhausted but satisfied. "The new protocol's harsh," she explained, "but he's strong." Sarah knew he would be. Michael and Rebecca found themselves in the empty break room, the Christmas music now seeming surreal against the night's drama. Coffee grew cold in their cups as snow continued falling outside. "I forgot," Rebecca said suddenly. "Forgot what?" "What it feels like to care about something bigger than yourself." She stared into her coffee. Sarah knew, didn't she? Every day she knew. Michael thought of Sarah's late nights, her missed dinners, all the times he'd resented her dedication to the hospital. "She tried to tell me. I didn't want to hear it. We were so stupid." Rebecca's laugh held no humor. "Planning to spend her money while she was in here saving lives. Planning to run away to London," Michael added, as if running ever fixes anything. Their eyes met across the table, really seeing each other for the first time in months. The attraction that had burned so bright now felt hollow against the weight of what they'd witnessed. "I can't do this anymore," Rebecca said quietly. "Us. Any of it. I know." Dawn broke over Boston, painting the snow in pale gold. In his room, Tommy slept peacefully, vital signs strong and steady. His Pokemon cards lay scattered across his bedside table, the warriors he'd taught Michael to understand, just as Sarah had once tried to teach him about different kinds of battles. Christmas morning arrived at Mass General, bringing with it the kind of clarity that only comes after the longest nights. Michael and Rebecca went their separate ways, she back to the ER, he to Tommy's room to wait for him to wake up. Some battles, Sarah had known, are fought not in operating rooms or corporate boardrooms, but in the quiet spaces where hearts learn to see differently. The storage closet on the third floor hadn't been opened since Sarah's death. Michael discovered it while helping Grace reorganize medical supplies, its door hidden behind boxes of latex gloves and surgical masks. That was her private space, Grace said softly, where she'd go to think, to write, to breathe. The key was still in the lock as if waiting. Inside, the small room smelled faintly of the lavender hand cream Sarah used to combat hospital antiseptic. A small desk lamp cast warm light over a space barely bigger than a coat closet. "Should we—" Michael gestured at the boxes of patient files. Grace shook her head. "Take your time. Some things need to be found slowly." Alone in Sarah's sanctuary, Michael noticed the details. A small electric kettle, her Yale Medical School mug, lipstick still staining the rim, and there on the desk a leather-bound journal he'd never seen before. The first entry was dated 3 years ago. "Caught Michael looking at Rebecca Walsh today during the hospital fundraiser. The way he used to look at me. Before surgeries and overnight shifts built walls between us. I should be angry, instead I'm tired. Too tired to fight for someone who stopped fighting for us long ago." Michael's hands shook as he turned the page. "Tommy asked about my husband again. Wanted to know why he never visits." I showed him our honeymoon photo. Told him about the man who once drove across Boston in a snowstorm to bring me coffee during a 30-hour shift. Sometimes I tell these stories to remember that version of us myself. Each entry revealed a Sarah he'd forgotten or never known. Her frustrations, her hopes, her quiet observations of his affair with Rebecca. Not just the facts, but the emotional toll. Found another Four Seasons receipt in his coat. Room 842. Always the same room. Part of me wants to storm in, create the scene he probably expects. But today I lost a 6-year-old on my table, and somehow Michael's betrayal seems small against that kind of grief. Maybe that's what he never understood. Why I could forgive his affair, but not his indifference to what matters. A loose page fell from the journal, covered in Sarah's hurried handwriting. "Barbara thinks I'm being too generous with the will's terms. Maybe I am. But Michael was kind once, before ambition and Rebecca Walsh reshaped him. He read medical journals just to understand my day. He held my hand through failed surgeries. That man is still in there, buried under real estate deals and lies. I'm not naive. I know about the late meetings, the Morrison Project excuses. I know he thinks I'm too absorbed in my work to notice. But that's exactly why this matters, why they need to understand. Some lessons can only be learned in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments when life and death dance so close together that everything else falls away. My chest hurts more lately. The ECG shows nothing, but I know my heart is tired, not just from work, but from watching the man I love become someone I barely recognize. Still, I believe in second chances, even if I'm not here to see them take it. The last entry was dated the night she died. Final surgery today. Emily's tumor was complex, but we got it all. Her father cried, asked how he could ever repay me. I told him to read her stories, to make every moment matter. That's all any of us can do. The will is ready. Barbara understands my instructions. Michael will be angry at first and Rebecca will fight it. But maybe somewhere between changing bedpans and holding dying children's hands, they'll learn what I tried so hard to teach them. That love isn't about grand gestures or secret hotel rooms. It's about showing up. It's about staying when things get hard. It's about finding beauty in the broken places and hope in the darkest hours. My heart feels strange tonight, heavy, like it knows something I don't. But I've done what I can, set the lesson in motion. Now it's up to them to learn it. I hope they do. I hope they understand. I hope. The entry ended there, an unfinished hope trailing into silence. Michael sat in Sarah's secret space until dawn, surrounded by the ghosts of words he should have said and truths he should have seen. Outside, the hospital hummed with life and death, love and loss, all the lessons Sarah had tried to teach him, all the lessons he was finally ready to learn. The emergency room never sleeps, but 3 a.m. has its own particular rhythm. Rebecca stood at the nurse's station, reviewing charts as monitors beeped in steady percussion, and fluorescent lights hummed their endless chorus. 6 months into their sentence, service, she corrected herself, and the designer bags under her eyes had become permanent accessories. Walsh, Dr. Patel's voice cut through her exhaustion. We need you in Trauma 1. The girl couldn't have been more than 4. Dark curls, pink light-up sneakers, and skin that was rapidly turning blue. Her mother hovered nearby, speaking rapid-fire Spanish that Rebecca had learned enough of to understand. She just stopped breathing. Anaphylactic shock, Dr. Patel announced, already moving. Get me epinephrine. Rebecca knew her role now, could perform it in her sleep. Hold the child, comfort the mother, pass instruments, count breaths, pray, though she'd never been religious before the ER. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the way the little girl's curls reminded her of her own childhood photos. Maybe it was 6 months of watching too many children suffer. Maybe it was the weight of Sarah's ghost, always present in these halls. The girl's heart stopped. Rebecca watched Dr. Patel start compressions, her own hands steadying the mother who was crumpling against her. Time stretched like taffy, measured in the spaces between heartbeats that weren't coming. Come on, sweetheart, Dr. Patel murmured. Fight. But sometimes fight isn't enough. Sometimes pink sneakers stop lighting up and mothers make sounds that can't be translated into any language, and volunteer coordinators, who used to be high-powered real estate agents, find themselves sliding down walls in supply closets, gasping for air that won't come. Rebecca? Jenny Kim's voice pierced her panic. The pediatric surgeon must have been called down for a consult. Look at me. Breathe. I can't. Rebecca gestured helplessly at the trauma room, where they were pronouncing time of death. She was the same age as my niece. I know. Jenny sat beside her on the floor, designer scrubs meeting standard issue ones. Sarah used to hide in here too. The name hit like a physical blow. She never seemed affected by any of it. No? Jenny's laugh was gentle. Ask Michael about the journal he found, about how many times Sarah broke down in this very closet. The difference was she got back up, kept going because someone had to. Rebecca wrapped her arms around her knees, designer watch catching the fluorescent light. 6 months ago it had seemed important. Now it just felt heavy. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. Not the hospital, not Michael, not pretending the money matters. Then don't. Rebecca looked up sharply. The will was never about the money. Jenny stood, offering her hand. Sarah knew that. Question is, do you? The walk to Barbara Henderson's office took exactly 27 minutes. Rebecca counted each step, each breath, each memory of children she'd helped save and lose over the past 6 months. Barbara didn't seem surprised to see her, even at 4 a.m. Ms. Walsh, I'm done. Rebecca's voice was steady now. Not with the service. I'll finish my year, but I don't want the money, any of it. Barbara's expression didn't change. Sarah thought you might reach this point. She did? She said some people need to lose everything to find what they're worth. Barbara pulled out a document. Sign here. Rebecca stared at the paper, a formal withdrawal of all claims to Sarah's estate. Her hand didn't shake as she signed, watching her flowing signature surrender $32 million. What will you do now? Barbara asked. Through the window, Rebecca could see the first hints of dawn touching the Boston skyline. The same view Sarah must have had when she planned all this. The ER is short-staffed, she said quietly. They're offering training for physician assistants. It's not exactly selling luxury condos, but Barbara's smile was the first genuine one Rebecca had ever seen from her. Sarah would have appreciated the irony. Walking back to the ER, Rebecca passed the trauma room where they'd lost the little girl. The mother was gone, but the pink sneakers remained, no longer lighting up. Some lessons Sarah had known cost everything to learn, but maybe that was the point all along. Barbara Henderson's office felt different in the morning light. 8 months into his service at the hospital, Michael sat in the same chair where he'd first learned of Sarah's conditions, but now his scrubs replaced the designer suit, and the calluses on his hands came from changing beds rather than signing contracts. Sarah left this for you. Barbara placed a sealed envelope on the desk, with instructions to deliver it after Rebecca withdrew her claim. Michael stared at his name in Sarah's distinctive handwriting, each letter precise, just like her surgical notes. You knew she would withdraw. Sarah knew. Barbara's smile held a hint of pride. She said the hospital has a way of stripping people down to who they really are. The envelope felt heavy, though it held only a single sheet of paper. My dearest Michael, if you're reading this, it means 2 things. I'm gone, and the lessons are finally taking hold. I wonder which was harder for you to accept. I spent weeks crafting the perfect letter. All the things I should say about betrayal, about Hotel Room 842, about watching you fall in love with Rebecca Walsh while I was saving lives. But sitting here in my office, looking out at the city we once planned to conquer together, none of that seems important anymore. Do you remember our first apartment? That tiny studio where you used to read medical journals aloud while I studied for boards? You'd stop every few paragraphs to ask questions, genuinely curious about surgical procedures and patient care. Somewhere between that studio and our Beacon Hill townhouse, we lost that curiosity about each other's worlds. I'm not writing to make you feel guilty. God knows the hospital has probably done that better than I ever could. I'm writing because today I watched a father learn his daughter's cancer was in remission, and all I could think was, this is what matters. These moments, these victories, these tiny miracles that happen every day in these halls. That's what I wanted you to understand, why I worked the long hours, why I missed dinners and parties and your corporate events. Every time you were with Rebecca, I was with someone who needed me more. It wasn't a competition, it was a calling. I knew about the affair for 3 years, not because you were careless, though the Four Seasons receipts weren't exactly subtle, but because I saw you stopping asking questions about my day, about my patients, about why I kept fighting even when we lost. You found someone who shared your world of property values and profit margins, and I couldn't blame you. We all seek understanding where we can find it. But I loved you too much to let you stay that person, the man who measured worth in square footage and closing deals, the man who forgot how to see magic in everyday miracles. So I crafted one last surgery of sorts, removing the tumors of greed and indifference before they could corrupt your soul completely. Tommy told me yesterday that his latest scans are clear. He wants to be a doctor now, just like Dr. Sarah. But I've seen you with him, Michael. I've watched through others' eyes as you've learned to sit with pain, to hold space for fear, to celebrate small victories. Maybe that's a different kind of healing. My heart is failing. The tests don't show it yet, but I know my body's rhythms. I've made peace with it just as I've made peace with us. I hope by now you understand that this was never about punishment. It was about redemption, about remembering the man who once drove through a snowstorm just to bring me coffee during a long shift. I forgave you long ago for Rebecca. I hope you'll forgive me for this final lesson. And I hope, somewhere between changing bedpans and holding dying children's hands, you've remembered what matters. With all my love, Sarah. P.S. Check the bottom drawer of my desk in the oncology ward. I left something for Tommy. He'll know when to give it to you. Michael read the letter 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. Outside Barbara's window, the hospital continued its eternal rhythm of life and death, victory and loss. She knew, he said finally, his voice rough. Everything. She knew who you could be, Barbara corrected gently. Sometimes that's more important than knowing what someone has done. The morning sun caught the edge of Sarah's letter, illuminating one last line he'd missed. Some lessons can only be taught with love, even when it hurts, even when it's goodbye. 10 months into his service, Michael found himself in Sarah's old office, now serving as a makeshift storage room for the oncology ward. Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, helping sort through boxes of her medical journals and patient files. "Bottom drawer," she said, Tommy asked, running his fingers along the old desk's wooden panels. "In her letter." Michael paused, watching the boy who had become so much more than just a patient. Tommy's hair had started growing back, dark wisps a testament to his ongoing victory over cancer. "She left something here for me." The drawer stuck slightly, years of disuse making the wood swell. When it finally opened, they found a single Pokemon card in a protective sleeve. "No way!" Tommy's eyes widened. "That's a first edition Charizard. Dr. Sarah said this was her secret weapon, but she never showed it to me." Michael turned the card over. Sarah's handwriting covered the back. For Michael, when he's ready to understand that the rarest things in life aren't things at all, give him the card, Tommy, when you think he's learned to see magic again. "Is that why you wanted to help sort through her office today?" Michael asked, realization dawning. Tommy grinned. "You've been ready for weeks, especially after you turned down that big real estate deal to spend more time volunteering." The deal, a $40 million development project that would have required him to cut back his hospital hours. 6 months ago it would have been irresistible. Now it seemed insignificant compared to monitoring Tommy's recovery or helping new patients through their first chemotherapy sessions. "Doctor, Kim said you're applying for the hospital board," Tommy continued, carefully placing the Pokemon card in Michael's hand. "Someone needs to advocate for expanding the pediatric ward." Michael tucked the card into his pocket, feeling its weight like a benediction. Sarah had plans drawn up before. The architects are reviewing them now. Tommy began restacking medical journals. "Are you going to use her money for it?" The question hung in the air, touching on the decision Michael had been wrestling with for weeks. His year of service was almost complete. Soon he'd have access to Sarah's entire estate, the properties, the investments, everything she'd built. "No," he said finally. "I'm not." Tommy stopped sorting. "But Dr. Sarah wanted me to understand what really matters." Michael pulled out his phone, showing Tommy the email he'd drafted to Barbara. "That's why I'm signing everything over to the hospital, permanently." The email laid out his plan, establishing a trust dedicated to pediatric care with Jenny Kim and Barbara Henderson as trustees. The properties would be sold, the money channeled into expanding not just Mass General's facilities, but pediatric programs across Boston. "What about your big house and your company?" Michael smiled, remembering Sarah's words about stripping down to who you really are. "The house goes to the trust too. I'm moving into a smaller place closer to the hospital. As for the company," he hesitated, "I'm stepping down as CEO. The board can handle development projects. I'm needed here more. Because of Dr. Sarah's lesson? Because some things are worth more than money." Michael stood, looking around the office that had been Sarah's sanctuary. "She tried to tell me that for years. I just wasn't ready to hear it." Tommy reached into his pocket, pulling out his own worn deck of Pokemon cards. "Want to play one last game before rounds? I'll even let you use the Charizard." "Sure, buddy." Michael settled back on the floor. "But first, tell me again about that time Sarah sneaked you ice cream after your first chemo. I want to remember everything." Through the office window, Boston's afternoon light painted the room gold, catching the edges of Sarah's medical journals and the worn corners of Tommy's Pokemon cards. Somewhere in the hospital, monitors beeped, marking the rhythm of lives being saved and changed. And in his pocket, a rare Pokemon card carried a final message from his wife, reminding him that sometimes the most valuable transformations come disguised as losses. He had one more month of mandatory service. But Michael Martinez already knew he'd be staying much longer than that. Some lessons, once learned, become choices. And he was finally choosing what mattered. 1 year to the day after Sarah's will reading, Michael sat in the newly renovated pediatric oncology ward, a worn copy of Harry Potter open on his lap. Tommy, now officially in remission, sat beside him helping to dramatize the voices for their newest patient, a wide-eyed 7-year-old girl starting her first round of chemotherapy. "You're doing it wrong," Tommy whispered. Dr. Sarah always made Hagrid sound more growly. Michael adjusted his voice accordingly, earning a giggle from their audience. The sound echoed through the room, bouncing off walls now painted with murals of magical creatures, part of the ward's renovation funded by the sale of his Beacon Hill house. "Mr. M?" The girl, Sophie, interrupted. Did you know Dr. Sarah, too? Michael exchanged a glance with Tommy. I did. She was my wife. Tommy says she was magic, that she could make scary things not so scary. She was better than magic, Michael said, touching the Pokemon card he still carried in his pocket. She knew that sometimes the scariest things teach us the most important lessons. Through the window, he could see the hospital board members leaving their monthly meeting. His proposal for expanding the pediatric program to 3 more hospitals had passed unanimously. Jenny Kim had smiled knowingly when he presented it, recognizing Sarah's influence in every detail. Rebecca's absence at the meeting wasn't surprising. She'd left Boston 2 months ago, accepted into a physician assistant program in Chicago. Her last email mentioned working nights in a children's hospital there, another life transformed by Sarah's final lesson. Time for rounds, Tommy announced, checking his junior volunteer badge with pride. At 13, he'd become something of a legend in the ward, the warrior who beat cancer and stayed to help others fight their battles. One more chapter, Sophie pleaded. Tomorrow, Michael promised. Stories are like medicine, best taken in proper doses. He watched Tommy lead Sophie through their ritual of naming her IV pole. She chose Sir Dragonslayer and decorating it with stickers. A year ago, he wouldn't have understood the importance of these small ceremonies. Now he knew they were as crucial as any medical procedure. Later, in what had once been Sarah's secret office and was now a quiet space for families needing a moment of peace, Michael found himself updating his own journal. Sarah's leather-bound one sat on the shelf above him, a reminder and a guide. 1 year, he wrote. The lesson's supposed to be complete, but I'm beginning to think Sarah knew this was just the beginning. Every day here teaches me something new about the person I almost stopped being, about the person she always knew I could become again. A knock at the door interrupted his writing. Barbara Henderson stood there, holding a familiar envelope. Last chance, she said. The trust becomes irrevocable at midnight. Michael thought of his old life, the real estate empire, the corporate lunches, the hollow pursuit of more. He thought of room 842 at the Four Seasons, now as foreign to him as a distant country. I'm where I need to be, he said simply. Barbara nodded, unsurprised. Sarah would be proud. Sarah knew, Michael corrected gently. She always knew. The hospital intercom crackled. Code blue, pediatric oncology. Michael was moving before the announcement finished, his body responding with practiced urgency. This was his world now, not of property values and profit margins, but of small victories and shared battles. As he ran down the hallway, he passed the plaque outside the ward, the Sarah Chen Martinez Pediatric Center, where every story matters. Below it, in smaller letters, dedicated to second chances and the lessons love teaches us. Tomorrow, he would help new patients fight their battles. He would sit with worried parents, play Pokemon with scared children, and honor Sarah's legacy in all the ways that mattered. But right now, someone needed him. And Michael Martinez, no longer just a grieving widower or a chastened businessman, but a true heir to his wife's compassion, had a story to continue. It wasn't the ending Sarah had written. It was the beginning she had always hoped for.